Hello, and welcome to our online lecture for Psych 1101 and Psych 1010 at Lanier Technical College. My name is Michael Holman. I am a psychology instructor here at Lanier Tech, and I will be your narrator. Please note that these lectures are intended to assist you in better understanding the material and should not be considered a substitute for attending lecture, reading the text, or completing your assignments. With that said, let's get started on motivation and emotion. This time around, we're going to define motivation, including needs, drives, and incentives. We'll identify the theories of motivation. We will describe the biological and psychological contributions to hunger, explain the role of sex hormones and their sexual response cycle in human sexuality, describe achievement motivation, identify the theoretical explanations of emotions. So true or false? Getting away from it all by going on a vacation from all sensory input for a few hours is relaxing. This one is kind of tricky, depends on who you talk to, but can often be considered false. People feel hunger due to contractions or pangs in the stomach. This is also false. Fashion magazines can contribute to eating disorders among women. This is true. Money can't buy you happiness. This is false. You may be able to fool a lie detector by squiggling your toes. This is true. So, we're starting off with emotion. Well, emotions are feeling states with physiological, cognitive, remember that means mental, and behavioral components. An emotion is a psychological state with four components. They have a positive or negative subjective experience, in this case it does mean good and bad, the activation of a specific mental processes and stored information, bodily arousal, and characteristic overt behavior. There are certain universal facial expressions that we see across the board. Things like anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, surprise. These are things that, regardless of where you come from, we are able to recognize that you are feeling that emotion. Your voice, your posture, and your gestures all provide clues to this. So name this emotion. This would be happy. That's sad. That's fear. That's anger. And that's surprise. And this last one is disgust. So the question becomes, are emotions universal? Well, to answer this question, we asked members of the Foray tribe in New Guinea to identify Caucasian facial expressions. We asked them to identify this because this was a unique tribe that had never before encountered Caucasians. So, when asked to identify various emotions, as you can see in this handy graph here, a lot of these different emotions that we've already mentioned as already being universal, they could identify, even though they had never seen someone that looked like that before. There are 7 expressions most commonly recognized by many cultures: anger, fear, disgust, happiness, surprise, sadness, and contempt. The thing about emotions, though, is that we can experience them separately but at the same time. Both good and bad emotions are independent and can occur at the same time in many combinations. You can have approach emotions like love, happiness, things where you want to hug somebody, for example. You can also have withdrawal emotions, fear, disgust, things that make you pull back or withdraw from someone. Positive psychology is a school of psychology that studies specifically contributing factors to happiness. And certain things that we know from this school of psychology include that genetics influence your happiness. For example, if you have depression running in your family, you're more likely to be depressed and therefore not as happy, so it's clearly affecting it. The impact of positive and negative events, socioeconomic circumstances, social relationships, religion, and attitudinal aspects. When talking about attitudinal aspects, we really are talking about something called cognitive bias. So remember, cognitive means mental or thinking, and bias means a predisposition towards thinking in a certain way. So a tendency to think in a certain way can affect how happy you are. There are a number of theories of emotions that we're going to talk about, and the first was developed by James Williams and Carl Lange. It's called the James-Lange theory of emotion. This theory says that a stimulus of some sort, maybe a snarling dog, produces a physical reaction, and this reaction is the arousal of the fight or flight response, or wanting to run, caused by your sympathetic nervous system. It works like this. An event occurs, something happens, and this causes your body to physically respond. When your body physically responds, you then interpret that physical change and experience an emotion, and this happens very rapidly. According to this theory, you feel emotions after your body reacts. James and Lange said that external stimuli instinctively trigger specific patterns of arousal and action. Emotions are just byproducts of automatic physical responses. But the problem with this theory is that it would require a distinct physical response for every emotion. Have you ever been so happy that you cried? Well, crying would probably be considered a physical response for sadness, yet you're happy and you're doing it. So that clearly doesn't really help this theory. The next theory we're going to talk about is Cannon and Bard. So created by Walter Cannon and Philip Bard, they believe that emotion and the physical arousal occur basically at the same time. Unlike James and Lange, Cannon and Bard believed that sensory information was sent simultaneously by your thalamus to the cortex and the organs of the sympathetic nervous system. It works like this. Something happens, and at the same time, you experience both a physical response and the emotion itself. The event causes both. Cannon and Bard said that the event simultaneously triggers bodily responses and experience of emotion, that our autonomic and muscular activity and our cognitive activity happen together. Emotions accompany these bodily responses. But again, there is criticism for this theory. Some responses, like pain, might trigger a physical response from you before you felt the emotion. For example, if you were walking along and you stepped on something, and you looked down and saw that there was a giant nail sticking through the top of your foot, you first felt the pain, and then you would probably feel some kind of emotion. So that kind of goes back to the James and Lange theory, but it doesn't really make sense for this one because you felt the physical response of pain first before you felt the emotion. So it's not quite right either. Which brings us to the cognitive arousal theory. Created by Schacter and Singer, this theory says that two things must happen before an emotion can occur. There's the physical arousal, or labeling of that arousal based on cues from the surrounding environment. And these two things happen simultaneously. And so basically this works like this. Something happens, you have an event of some kind, then you have arousal and physical responses. You then interpret that physical response based on the context of the situation you're in, and then you feel an emotion. Your arousal and the context combine to form your emotions. Emotions reflect arousal and appraisal of the situation, and the way we label our emotions depends on our appraisal of that situation. So here is a handy little chart to show you the three different major theories of emotion. James and Lange say that something happens, you feel a physical response, you appraise that physical response, and then you feel that specific emotion. Cannon and Bard said that something happens, your brain processes whatever happened, and you feel the physical response and the emotion at the same time. The cognitive appraisal theory says that something happens which at the same time allows for a physical response. You then interpret both of these things based on the situation, and then you experience your emotion. But if those three theories weren't enough, congratulations, there's a fourth. It is known as the emerging synthesis theory. And to sum this entire interesting image up, all it's really saying is that all of the other theories were right to a degree. That different emotions rely on different combinations of body and brain reactions and interpretations based on context before you feel that emotion. One interesting, more modern view of emotions is known as the facial feedback hypothesis. It is defined as the emotion that assumes that facial expressions provide feedback to the brain concerning the emotion being expressed. This, in turn, causes and intensifies that emotion. So according to this hypothesis, facial expressions can affect our emotional state. When we have had participants do one very famous study, what they would do is we would have them hooked up to a machine, and they would periodically get shocked with minor bouts of electricity. And the entire time, they were told that they had to either smile or make a pained expression. And what was interesting was that when polled later, the participants that were told they had to smile the whole time actually reported having more positive feelings about the entire procedure as a whole, while people that had to make a pained face the entire time said the shocks were way more painful than they actually should have been, thanks to the control group. We know, because of research like this, that there is a link between facial feedback and emotion, that the contraction of facial muscles can cause arousal, and that arousal boosts emotional response. So this is kind of going back to the James and Lange theory once again. And this also allows us to talk about polygraphs, or lie detectors. These guys monitor indicators of sympathetic arousal during an interrogation. These could be things like your heart rate, blood pressure, respiration rate, sweating, anything like that. Generally, polygraphs are considered unreliable. In many courts, polygraphs are no longer admitted as evidence. And I have a story to explain why. So, I once had a student when we were talking about this stuff, and she told me how she worked at a fast food restaurant, and someone had come in and not just robbed the place, but they stole the safe somehow. So they knew exactly where the safe was and how to move it, or that they could move it even. And so because of this kind of information, and based on how the person acted in the surveillance video, they knew that whoever it was that robbed the place had to have been someone that worked there recently. So they had all of the employees that it could have been, including this girl, take a lie detector test. And when she took the lie detector test, they told her that she essentially beat the lie detector test. Why? Because the way polygraphs work is that they first have to get a baseline. So they have to measure your heart rate, your blood pressure, your respiration rate, and all of this comes out on a printout where they're looking at the waves, if you remember brain waves and things of that nature. Same kind of thing. So they're monitoring that to see how active it is. And so they'll ask you to tell the truth. So what is your name? You know, what's your favorite color? Anything simple like that. This is to make sure they know what the printout looks like when you're telling the truth. And then they'll ask you to tell an obvious lie. They'll tell you to lie, and they'll ask you, where were you born? And you might say, on Mars. And what will happen is your heart rate, for example, might spike up a little bit. And so we'll see that spike. And so now we know what a lie looks like on a lie detector test for you. And so then when we ask you real questions, we can determine whether it was the truth or a lie. Well, so back to the student. How did she beat the system? Well, she was so nervous. She was so nervous the entire time that her baseline was all over the place. And so even if she were lying, they wouldn't be able to tell because it was so huge in the first place. And for that reason and many others, polygraphs are no longer admitted as evidence in most courts. So, back to the Schacter-Singer experiment. Participants were told in one particular experiment that they were receiving a vitamin supplement. However, they actually received a shot of epinephrine. Then, participants were separated into two different groups. One group was in a room with a bunch of people that were happy and hula hooping, all sorts of stuff, while the other group was in a room with a bunch of people that were angry and frowning. And so being around them led them to then be either happier or angrier, depending on the situation. And so what happened next was that the experimenters came back and they said, "We're so sorry, but we accidentally injected you with a foreign substance instead of what we thought we were giving you. We are so sorry." And depending on the situation that participants had already been divided into, their response was either, it's no big deal, accidents happen, I'm not hurt, or angry. "What do you mean you injected me with something and you don't know what it was?" Their emotional response depended on the context of the situation. So, we've talked a lot about where emotions come from. Now let's talk about a couple of specific emotions. The first of which is fear. Fear can often be characterized behaviorally as a fear-potentiated startle, that moment, right? There are 4 basic facts about fear. Fear can be an emotional reflex. It can also be classically conditioned, just like with little Albert. Fear interacts with mental processes, and the amygdala does not play a role in producing the emotional feel of fear. In fact, no one brain area gives rise to fear or any emotion. The opposite of fear is often happiness. Happiness is interesting because while fear will narrow the scope of your attention to where you're only paying attention to whatever it is that you're afraid of, happiness broadens that scope, and so you pay attention to all sorts of details. Happiness is related to life circumstances, realistic expectations, social support, genes, and the question becomes, does money really buy happiness? And if you've ever been broke, you know the answer to this. Yes. Yes, it does. It's not so much that having money itself is what makes you happy. It's that having money now symbolizes that you can pay for things that you couldn't pay for before. So that's where money can lead someone to having happiness. Alright, so that was emotion. Now, let's focus on the psychology of motivation. So, when we talk about motivation, we have to talk about both motives and incentives. Motives are hypothetical states that activate behavior toward a goal. Incentives are objects, persons, or situations that are viewed as capable of satisfying some kind of need or are desirable for their own sake. A need is a physical need. It is some kind of state of deprivation. You can also have psychological needs, so a need for attention, a need for reassurance. You can have a need for water, a need for food, a need for air. These are needs. These are things that you have to have in order to survive. Now, we fulfill these needs by following drives. A drive arouses us to action. So you have a need for food, but hunger is the drive that makes you eat. Motivation is the process by which activities are started, directed, and continued, and it moves people to do the things they intend to do. Usually because of an external reward or some sort, people are driven to do something. And there are 2 types of motivations out there: extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is motivation that comes outside of yourself. So, getting a good job, getting a good grade, getting praise from other people. This is all external. It's all extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is motivation that comes from within. It is internal. So this is something like that sense of self-accomplishment that you get from achieving a task, or that sense of pride that you get, or feeling of success when you do really well on an exam. That is intrinsic motivation. It came from inside of you. And there are a number of theories of motivation out there. And the first is the evolutionary perspective. It says that certain things we do are species-specific behaviors. These are instincts, or fixed action patterns, and that we also have inborn behavior patterns. Instincts are an inherited tendency to produce organized and unalterable responses to particular stimuli. But the weakness with this idea is that human behaviors are far more complex and flexible than instincts can explain. According to evolutionary psychologists, we are just biological computers following pre-programming all day, all night. And as we all know, there have been many times where we have gone against our better instincts. So if you have ever enjoyed bungee jumping or flying around in a roller coaster or anything like that, you have the instinct of self-preservation that should be telling you don't do that, you might die. But instead you do it anyways and you enjoy it. So clearly we will often go against our natural instincts. Evolutionary psychology says that we have certain hardwired goals like survival and finding mates, but that we also have certain cognitive strategies that are naturally built into us. Things like deception. I've mentioned this before, but you don't have to teach a baby to lie. Babies know how to lie. Nobody ever sat down with a baby and said, okay, so this is the truth, and this is how you say not the truth. Babies just know. Children know how to lie. It is a natural, instinctive strategy that we may use. One other interesting aspect of this is that we are constantly searching for stimulation. There are a number of reasons why. We might seek to increase stimulation because we're bored. We know that lower animals and humans seek novel stimulation. I always call myself a raccoon because if it's shiny, I'm going to want to pay attention to it. And what's interesting is this is actually an evolutionary advantage. The reason that we are at the top of the food chain is because of all the different inventions that we have. And most of those inventions were created because someone was sick of the current status quo. So someone invented the wheel one day because they didn't like having to carry things all over the place. Someone invented a cell phone because they didn't like that they had to go and use a landline. Someone invented the computer because they wanted to compute things faster. We invented the internet so that we could communicate with one another at a much faster rate and share information. So all of these different things happened because someone wanted to see something new. So because of our constant desire to keep ourselves from being bored, we're at the top of the food chain. The arousal theory states that we seek intermediate levels of stimulation. We don't want to be over or understimulated. When you're understimulated, you seek arousal. So when you're bored, you seek something to do. But when you're overstimulated, you seek less stimulation. Have you ever been to a party or a concert and it just got way too loud and so you had to leave for a moment and kind of collect yourself? Kind of get some air, that kind of thing? That was being overstimulated, and you did exactly like we just said. You sought less stimulation to get yourself back to a balance. This is part of the Yerkes-Dodson Law. And so we tested this theory by asking participants to perform a particular task. And one group of participants was not allowed to sleep at all. So they were very, very, very tired. The other group of participants got a normal amount of sleep and they were perfectly fine. And the next group got plenty of sleep, but they also had to chug several energy drinks. And so they were amped. They were wired. And when they finally performed the task, as you can see, obviously, the people that were very tired performed very low. And what's interesting is that the people that were wired, that were super aroused, they did not perform very well at all. It was only the people in the middle that were just right, that were at an intermediate level of arousal, that performed well on the task. Another part of the theory of motivation is incentives. We are motivated toward particular goals in anticipation of getting some kind of a reward. But sometimes we don't feel like that reward is actually there. And when we have no incentive to do something, we lose all motivation to do it in the first place. And that can be anything. And when that happens, when you lose all motivation, you may fall into a trap that is learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is the condition that occurs after an animal has an aversive experience in which nothing it does can affect what happens to it. And so it simply gives up and stops trying to change the situation or to escape. And the study that really proved this was yet another example of psychologists being the absolute worst. So in this study, we would have a dog in a cage, and we electrified the floor. So the dog kept getting electrocuted. There would sometimes even be a signal to let the dog know that the electricity was coming, but there was nowhere for the dog to escape. So the dog kept getting shocked. Eventually, the dog just gave up and would lie down and take the electric shock. What was more interesting, though, was that later we added a partition. And so we separated the room so that half of the room on the other side of the partition would not have any electricity in it. So it wouldn't have any electric shocks. We even sent out a warning sound to let the dog know the shocks were coming so he could get to the other side where it was safe. And we showed him that it was safe. And the dog stayed on his side and did not jump to the safe side. He allowed himself to continue getting electrocuted. Why? Because he had lost all motivation to try and do anything. And so he believed there was nothing he could do. This helps explain why many people might say stay with an abusive spouse. Because they believe that nothing they can do will ever help them to escape. That no matter what they do, so-and-so will find me, or something of that nature. We also see learned helplessness somewhere else. With students in their grades. You know, this is about halfway through the semester, and a lot of times students will feel so frustrated they may want to drop or just give up on the class entirely. And I'm here to warn you, don't fall for that trap. Don't fall into learned helplessness, because there are still options. You can still do your homework. There is extra credit that is available for this course that can help you to do better in this course. There are ways to escape. Don't be like the dog in the learned helplessness experiment. If there is a way to get out and to save your grade, take it. But so many students choose not to take those opportunities, and so at the end of the semester, not only did they fail, but they didn't do any of the extra credit. They didn't turn in the big critical thinking assignments. They didn't do anything because they had already decided that there was nothing they could do that would help them to pass this class. So just make sure that you don't fall into that trap. We also need to talk about the difference between a need and a want. A need is a condition that arises from the lack of a requirement. You need food, you need air, you need water. A want is something you want. For example, I need food. I don't need a PlayStation 4. I want a PlayStation 4, but I don't need a PlayStation 4. I will survive. I will not die without a PlayStation 4, but I will die if I don't have food. Needs and drives includes the concept of a requirement of some kind of material that is essential for your survival, like food or water. When an organism has a need, it leads to psychological tension and physical arousal. And this brings the organism to act to fulfill the need. That's called a drive. There are several types of rewards. There are deprived rewards, meaning that you have to have this reward. You are deprived of it, and so you need it. And non-deprived. These are just things that you want, that you enjoy. There are also many types of needs. There's a need for achievement and a need for cognition. So need for achievement means a need to achieve something, but also need for cognition, a need to think, a need to use your mind, to not be mindless, to try and do something a little more intellectual, perhaps. Drive reduction theory includes a concept known as homeostasis. This is the tendency of your body to maintain a steady state. It is the body's version of a thermostat. When there is a primary drive need, the body is in a state of imbalance, and this behavior brings the body back to the balance or homeostasis. For example, if you have not eaten, you're going to get hungry. So what do you do when you're hungry? You eat. Well, when you eat, you raise the glucose levels in your body. As glucose levels raise, your hunger decreases. And so because your hunger decreases, you do not eat. Because you didn't eat, your glucose levels go down. Because they've gone down, your hunger now increases, and the whole thing starts all over again. That is homeostasis. Okay, so we've talked about basic motivation concepts. Let's talk about being motivated to achieve something. Well, one way that we have studied this is using the TAT test, or the Thematic Apperception test, which is a test in which students are asked to tell a story based around a picture that they're shown. And so they did these studies on college students, McClellan did, and found that there was a relationship between achievement motivation and career choices. So based on their participants' responses, they found that many of them had more responses that were motivated to perform well, and this had a direct connection, a correlation, if you will, to the career that they had chosen for their field. So if they chose more difficult careers, they more likely were more motivated to achieve something in their stories. We know that performance goals can be extrinsic, so they can be rewards like praise or income, but they can also be what we would call learning goals. These are more intrinsic rewards like self-satisfaction. We know that in individualist cultures, they emphasize the rights and responsibilities of the individual over those of the group. But in collectivist cultures, they emphasize the rights and responsibilities of the group over those of the individual. To give you a bit of background, individualist cultures are usually most Western cultures, so the United Kingdom, Canada, and of course the United States, while collectivist cultures are usually found in more Eastern countries, so Japan, China, Korea, places like that. So when talking about drive reductionism, we know that certain primary drives activate behavior: hunger, thirst, pain, and other drives are acquired. They are learned. And these are gained through experience. So you learn to need money, you learn to want social approval, or to be affiliated with people. We also have homeostasis, which, as we've already mentioned, is the tendency of the body to maintain a steady state. Humanistic theory is a specific theory found within psychology, and its founder was Abraham Maslow. Maslow said that we are motivated by a conscious desire for personal growth, to be better. That humans have a unique capacity for self-actualization, or becoming the best version of ourselves that we can possibly be. And to illustrate this, he came up with a very famous image known as the hierarchy of needs. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs looks like this. You've got physical needs, or physiological needs, at the bottom. This is stuff you have to have or you'll die. Then you have safety needs. These are things like shelter, protection, having a good job, so that you can keep your physical needs safe. Belongingness needs are having a sense of belonging and love. Well, once you feel like you're belonged and loved by others, you can move to esteem needs, and having a mastery and feeling of being appreciated by others. So this is both self-esteem and public esteem. Once you are well-liked in your situation and you like yourself, you can move to cognitive needs. You now want to understand the world. You become more curious. And once you feel like you understand the world, we move on to aesthetic needs. Now that you understand the world, you want to make sense of it. You want to bring order to the world. And once you've brought order to the world, we lead to self-actualization needs, to be all that you are capable of becoming. Now, in a perfect world, we would fulfill all of our physical needs and then move up and up to the next and the next and the next. But usually we have various needs from each one of these. And what Maslow warned us not to do was to put any one of these needs above the others. You want to make sure that you take care of physical needs first so that you don't starve to death. And on and on and on, sure. But if you take care of, say, safety needs more than any of the other needs, then this can create a ripple effect that damages the rest of the needs. And so you find yourself in a very precarious position. For example, I have a story of a client who came to me during crisis hours, meaning that she was in crisis. She was, in all honesty, very suicidal in that moment. And the reason why was because she had no support system. She was alone. She had some friends, but no one else really. Her parents did not support her. She was working a job, but the boss was a real jerk and did not allow her to be flexible with her hours at all. Not only that, but she was a waitress and she was surviving off of tips, and she wasn't making a whole lot of tips. Plus, the boss said that, for example, if she had to be at work at 3 p.m., she had to be at work at 3 p.m. Even if she had a class that maybe got out at 2:45 and it took her 20 minutes to get to work. So that would mean that she would have to leave class early every single day to make sure that she was getting to work on time, or else she'd be fired. And she did all this because she had no money and she didn't make much to begin with. So, in order to try and make ends meet, she was taking all of her money and she was pouring it into the bills that she had to pay. It got to such an extent where she had no food in her house. And her friends, which few she had, actually pulled their money together so that she could buy a box of dollar store cake mix. And she made a cake in her oven because she had electricity, and that's what she ate. But she was so depressed about her situation because she was failing school as a result, she was struggling financially, she was starving herself to death, and she felt like she had no one to talk to and be honest about what she was struggling with, that she ended up being ready to commit suicide. And that's why she came to me in my crisis hours office. One thing to keep in mind that we talked about was that she had put her safety needs above everything else. Nothing else was as important as her safety needs. She put it above her physical needs, her belongingness needs, her cognitive needs. So because she made that so much more important than anything else, it caused ripple effects that led all the way up to self-actualization and her not wanting to be herself at all. Another perspective that looks at motivation is the cognitive perspective. Remember, that is thinking. This shows that the world is represented mentally. It is when we strive to eliminate inconsistencies and are motivated to justify our behaviors and beliefs. Now, I've been talking about motivation and drives, and I mentioned that hunger is one of our most powerful drives. So let's focus on hunger a little bit, alright? There are certain biological influences on hunger. There are signals of satiety like chewing and swallowing, and you can also have hunger pangs that tell you when you're hungry. We know that your hypothalamus is largely responsible for why you feel hungry. Within it, we have the ventromedial nucleus, or VMN, that functions as a stop-eating center. In individuals that are hyperphagic, this VMN is either damaged or non-existent, and so they never know when to stop eating. These people will eat so much and always feel hungry to the point where they might actually eat themselves to death. Now, on the flip side, we know your lateral hypothalamus functions as a start-eating center. And for people that are aphagic, this is either damaged or not functioning well, or doesn't exist at all in their brain, and so they are aphagic, meaning that they never know when to eat. They never feel hungry, and so they could very easily starve to death. But the question becomes, is being hungry the opposite of being full? Really? Well, there are a lot of factors to consider. Things like your metabolism, the role of your stomach, the role of social factors. If you ever eat because everybody else is eating, that's the role of social factors. Or if you eat because it's lunchtime, right? Insulin can come into play. But sometimes when we eat too much. Your normal weight is your set point. But when you overeat, you go beyond this point. And that can lead to something called obesity, which is 20% heavier than the medical ideal. And the question becomes, are there such things as fat personalities, fat genes, or a fat environment? The answer is yes to all three. If you have ever had to cope with stress or disappointment, and the way that you coped was by eating food, that's part of a fat personality. That is a coping mechanism that you use very often, and I do it myself as well, and it can lead to becoming obese if you're coping with too much stuff at one time. Question also becomes, fat genes. Well, it turns out that our ancestors, many of them, were walking across the savannah for miles and miles on foot, or they were traveling across the prairie, or they were going across mountains, and that took a lot of energy, and they were doing that to hunt down food, you know. But having genes that allowed for their bodies to hold on to fat longer was actually an evolutionary advantage. they were able to survive out in the hot sun longer than people whose bodies weren't able to do that. And so they were able to survive long enough to have children that then passed those genes on as well. And we inherited those genes. The only problem is we don't chase water buffalo for miles and miles on foot to get our next meal. No, if we're lucky, we will walk down the street, or we'll get in a car and we'll go get some fast food, right? So we are not living the same kind of lifestyle, but our bodies are still holding on to that fat, and so we can possibly become obese ourselves. So ironically, what kept our ancestors alive might be killing some of us today. And then finally, fat environment. Well, name some southern foods. Chitlins, fried chicken, chicken and dumplings, collard greens, all sorts of stuff, right? Lots of fried. If it's fried, we're going to eat it. That is a fat environment. That is unhealthy food that you regularly eat. Maybe you're a part of a family that has massive meals. In many Italian families, food is a very big deal, and mom and her grandma will be in the kitchen all day making a massive meal, and you are expected to eat every bit of it. In some Russian cultures, they will often, for a job interview, ask people to eat in front of them, to have dinner with their potential boss. And they'll hire the person who ate the most because they believe that that person will make the best worker. So you can have an environment, a culture that encourages overeating, absolutely. And when that happens, you might find yourself becoming obese as well. Dieting is a great way to combat obesity, but unfortunately many people take dieting to extremes. Biological factors, as we've mentioned before, can be heredity, body fat, metabolism, anything like that. But you also have to keep in mind psychological factors. Observational learning. If you learn to eat your feelings from watching your parents, then you might do it yourself. If you are stressed out, or if you're feeling highly emotional, so that's when you eat, those are all coping mechanisms that can also lead to obesity. For example, whenever I'm having a stressful day at work, usually at the end of the day, I will leave, I'll go to the nearest fast food restaurant, and I'll get myself the biggest, juiciest, greasiest, grossest hamburger with cheese and bacon and several patties on it, right? And the grease is just falling onto the page. And I'll eat it, and I'll think, I deserve this. You know, I have been working really hard today, right? And so we do that all the time, whether it's a burger or it's cheesecake or pie or ice cream, whatever it may be. We often will use food as a coping mechanism, and doing that too often can lead to serious issues. Unfortunately, we can also have serious issues when we diet to extreme measures, and these are known as eating disorders. They're characterized by persistent, gross distortions in eating patterns. The two main ones we'll be talking about are anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. Anorexia nervosa is a life-threatening eating disorder characterized by extreme fear of being too heavy, traumatic weight loss, distorted body image, and resistance to eating enough to reach or maintain a healthy weight. It is most common in women during adolescence and young adulthood. So anorexia is when you don't eat. You are so afraid of becoming heavy that you choose not to eat any food at all. Bulimia nervosa is when you have repeated cycles of binge eating and purging, and tends to afflict women during adolescence and young adulthood. There are a number of ways that you can both binge and purge. First, let's talk about binging. Binging means that you go to the store or a restaurant and you buy as much food as you possibly can. We're talking entire kitchens worth of food, and you eat all of it in one sitting. That's what we mean by binging. And usually what happens with bulimic patients is that they become so ashamed of the binging that they just did that they then must purge to get all of that food out. And they can purge either through vomiting, through taking a diuretic or a laxative, or even through sweating, so excessive exercise to get rid of it. Where do eating disorders come from? Well, family dynamics play a huge role. we have to think about how important is eating and dieting in the family. And the question becomes, if eating and dieting is so important to the family, is that considered child abuse? Because the problem with this is that if you've ever had someone tell you, maybe you should eat a salad instead, or are you sure you should eat that? That's really fattening. Any kind of, backhanded comment like that, it can develop a complex among young girls especially, although we do see this in males now as well, within the same age range. If you have parents that think that they're just trying to encourage you to be healthy, but are saying these kinds of comments over and over again, things we call microaggressions, then it could very well be helping that child to develop an eating disorder, which can kill them. There have been many cases of people with bulimia and anorexia where they died due to the condition or due to complications from the condition. Socioculturally speaking, we know that our own culture idealizes thin females. When we think about the perfect woman, women are expected to have thin waists, large breasts, large butts, to have the perfect face. Eyebrows have to be on fleek. They've got to have nice hair. They've got to have bangs. They've got to have arms that are toned but not too strong, and nice legs. They've got to have the thigh gap. All sorts of stuff, right? That is a lot of things to be telling teenage girls they need to be doing. And we don't say it all at once, but remember, children and kids, teenagers even, will hold on to this information like a sponge and try to do all of it at once. So is it any wonder that they might be developing a complex as a result? That's what we mean by the influence of sociocultural climate. Okay, so we've been talking about the drive of hunger at this point. Now we're going to go to the next piece of motivation, sexual motivation. So we know, biologically speaking, that there are certain activating effects, that testosterone will increase your sex drive, and many female animals are receptive to males only during estrus, or when they're in heat. But there is also an organizing effect that predisposes lower animals towards stereotypical mating patterns, like behaving more masculine or more feminine. We do not see this in higher animals, such as humans. The sexual response cycle works as follows. It starts with vasocongestion. This is swelling of the genital tissue with blood. In men, this means getting an erection. There's also myotonia, or when your muscles become tense. The sexual response cycle has excitement, followed by plateau, followed by an orgasm, and then resolution. In men, there is a refractory period, which is simply how long between orgasms will it take them to next have an erection. For some guys, it's a few minutes. For some, it's a few hours, or a few days, a few months, or even a few years. It just depends on the guy. Here is an interesting chart that shows 3 basic variations of female sexual responses. So we see with female number 1, she got very excited. She reached her plateau. This is usually during the act of having sex. And then she had not just 1 orgasm, but 2 orgasms and resolution. She went to sleep. Then we look at female number 2, the purple. So she also got excited. She had a plateau, a little bit, still in the act of sex, still at the plateau period. She hasn't reached orgasm, and she doesn't reach orgasm. She just goes to read a book or something. And then we have excitement. So this is number 3. She gets excited. She gets more excited. She gets so excited that she shoots past the plateau all the way to an orgasm. And then resolution, she passes right out. And this is men. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. It is getting excited. There's the act of having sex during the plateau period. There's having an orgasm with a possible refractory period in between. And then there is resolution, or the taking a nap. Now, let's discuss sexual behavior a little bit, alright? It turns out when studying sex that we know that only 2% of all sex acts are done for reproductive purposes. 98% of the reason why we have sex is because it's recreational. Let's face it, sex feels good. Sex is enjoyable for most people, and they have fun, so they want to do it. They want to have sex. It's not always about making a baby. So you need to understand and remember that 98% most sex acts are done for pleasure, not to create a child. But the problem with studying sexual behavior is that it's difficult to study. I've mentioned this before, but the kind of person willing to tell me, a complete stranger, all the sordid details of their sex life is not necessarily representative of the rest of the United States, or really the rest of the world. So we have to keep that in mind and take these results with a little bit of a grain of salt. Now, there are a number of motives for having sex, and they can be broken down into either self-motivation, social motivation, approach motivation, or avoidance motivation. So you might combine self and avoidance and use sex to escape, avoid, minimize negative emotions or threats to your self-esteem. You might avoidance and social. Use sex to escape, avoid, or minimize negative social experiences. I don't want everybody to know I'm a virgin, or something like that. You might combine self and approach and use sex to enhance positive emotions or experiences. This is the one that is preferable. You're doing it because you want to and because it might make you feel more close with your partner. And you might combine approach and social, using sex to enhance social connections. This is essentially sleeping your way to the top. So there are a lot of reasons why people have sex. Let's talk about sexuality in adulthood. We know that the majority of adults, 80%, report having none or one sexual partner in the past year, with marriage being a factor. Most men between 18 and 59 have sex about 7 times per month, and most women in that same age range have sex about 6 times per month. Vaginal intercourse is nearly universal as the most widely practiced sexual activity among heterosexual couples. And 50% of older Americans reported sexual activity at least once per month. And so, yes, we are talking about people 60 and older. So, yes, folks, that means there is a 50% chance that your grandparents had sex this month. You're welcome. Also, it's very interesting, if you ever wanted to look into these stories, we now know that there is an epidemic of STIs plaguing nursing homes. Syphilis is incredibly on the rise amongst older Americans because they're still having sex in the nursing home, but they don't really see a point in using a condom. So again, just to recap, we know the sexual response cycle is excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. And when we study sexual behavior in the United States, there are 2 major surveys that we refer to. There's the Kinsey reports and the National Health and Social Life Survey. So Kinsey was a fascinating man who, back in the days of McCarthyism, actually went out and asked people all the sordid details of their sexual lives. He would ask them if they had sex with men, did they have sex with women, did they have sex with leather, any sort of thing. If it was a sexual question, he asked about it. And he wrote it all down, which could have gotten him in prison at the time, and produced it as a book. And one of the things that he developed from his exhaustive survey that went all over the United States was something known as the Kinsey scale. The Kinsey scale says that most people fall somewhere on a scale of sexuality between 1 and 6, with a Kinsey 1 being someone completely heterosexual, and a Kinsey 6 being someone completely homosexual. And interestingly enough, Kinsey found that most people are not a 1 or a 6. They're somewhere else in the middle. So very interesting stuff there. We also have the National Health and Social Life Survey, which also asked a lot of these interesting questions about sexual activities and is a more modern approach, and you'll see a lot of data come from this survey in this presentation. According to the National Health and Social Life Survey, we've found that education has a liberating influence on people's sexual behavior. You're more willing to experiment sexually if you've had more education, whereas if you've had a conservative religious experience, you have more of a restraining effect, so you're less willing to explore sexually. Ethnicity also comes into play, usually because most ethnicities tend to have a conservative religious experience as part of their cultural background. What's also interesting is that a recent study came out that was conducted by a porn website, and they polled their users simply by looking at their credit cards to see where those credit cards came from, because they were really curious about what states have the most porn purchases for their company. They were a very large company. And what they found actually was that the number one state that bought the most porn in any given year was, I believe it was either Mississippi or Missouri, but it was a Bible Belt state. In fact, all of the top 10 states were southern states, were Bible Belt states, or Midwestern states, states that were particularly considered especially conservative. So they were the ones buying the most porn, which shows that just because you might have a restrained effect from being in a conservative religious experience, it doesn't necessarily mean that those desires are going to go away. Now, we're going to talk about orientation, and there are a number of theories out there, some more accepted than others. One interesting thing to note is that we don't actually know why people are gay or straight or bi or anything in between. We don't have solid evidence, and we're still conducting quite a bit of knowledge and searching and research on this particular topic to this day. But we do have a couple of theories. The first is the learning theory, which says that you learn your sexual orientation based on reinforcement and observational learning. This has largely been debunked, and most people do not actually follow this theory, because according to this theory, it would mean that you saw someone being gay one time and that's why you're gay, or you saw your parents being straight and that's why you are a heterosexual. But the problem with that is when you have people that identify as gay adults, but their parents were heterosexuals. So clearly observational learning didn't really have an effect there in their orientation. Which brings us to genetic factors. There are twin studies which compared identical twins to fraternal twins, and they found that identical twins tend to have the same sexual orientation most of the time. So that told us that there probably was more of a biological component. We also know that sex hormones can have an impact. For example, the presence of testosterone can regulate sexual motivation, meaning that you are more willing to have sex in general if you have more testosterone. So we're going to talk about sexual orientations. These first three you're probably very familiar with. There's the heterosexual orientation, where you are sexually attracted to and interested in people of the opposite sex. There's the homosexual orientation. You're sexually attracted to and interested in people of your same sex. These people are often known as gay men and lesbians, or gay women. There are also bisexuals, people that are attracted to both females and males. And these are the standard sexual orientations that most people are pretty familiar with these days. But you might not have heard of these sexual orientations. These have been around just as long as any other sexual orientation that we've already covered, but they weren't really addressed by the scientific community until the last decade or two. The first is pansexual. This is someone that has a sexual attraction based on their personality and interest regardless of the partner's gender identity. So someone that identifies as pansexual will be attracted to intelligence, and it doesn't matter whether that person is male or female. They may be attracted to femininity, so they're attracted to someone that behaves very feminine. Doesn't matter what their genitals are. Or they might be attracted to someone that is masculine, or they might be attracted to someone that is very polite or very nice. They're attracted to kindness, that kind of thing. So it's more that they have a type and less that they care about what your genitals are when they're attracted to you. Asexuals are the other type. These people have no sexual attraction at all. Individuals may have sex, they may enjoy it, but they do not desire it. So they don't seek out sexual activity. They may do it if their partner wants it, but for them, it's kind of a mechanical process that maybe feels good, but they don't really care about. Among asexuals, there are two other types, sex-repulsed and demisexual. A sex-repulsed asexual not only is not interested in sex, they think it's disgusting. They don't want to have sex with anyone at any time, for any reason, even if it's their partner and they're married. Demisexuals are people that were originally asexual. They had no attraction towards sex with anyone for any reason, but eventually they develop a relationship. They develop a connection with someone very close to them, and they find themselves sexually attracted, but only to that person. So they suddenly experience sexual attraction, but it is because of the strong connection that they have with this one person, and only with this person. So it takes a strong connection before they will become sexually attracted to anyone. Another interesting thing that we want to talk about is romantic orientation. So this refers to an individual's pattern of romantic attraction based on someone's gender. This is considered distinct from sexual orientation because that refers specifically to a person's patterns of sexual attraction. And to understand the difference, keep in mind that it is very easy to have sex with someone and not love them. And that's just a fact. And so that's what romantic orientation is all about, is that you might have the capacity to love someone, but that doesn't mean that you're sexually attracted to them. Here is a handy little chart to show the difference between sexual attraction and romantic attraction. Note that there are really the exact same categories, whether we're talking about sexual attraction or romantic attraction. It's just one is talking about who, if anyone, you want to have sex with, and the other is talking about who, if anyone, you want to fall in love with. Further definitions that we'd like to talk about include intersexed individuals. Being intersex is a condition in which a person's biological sex is ambiguous, often combining aspects of both male and female anatomy and/or physiology. They used to be known as hermaphrodites, but this is now considered a very offensive term. Intersex people represent roughly 1.06, I believe, % of the world population, which doesn't sound like a whole lot until I tell you that that's about the same number of redheads that exist in the world today. So if you know a redhead, it's very possible that you might know someone that is intersexed. Someone becomes intersexed during the embryonic stage of the womb. I've mentioned this in a previous chapter, the human development chapter, but when we are in the embryonic stage, we all start out, biologically speaking, in the female template. And the Y chromosome kicks in males and causes things like the clitoris to enlarge and become a penis, and for the ovaries to transform into testes and to descend and become testicles. However, among people that are intersexed, this process stopped at some point. And it could be anywhere. They might have an enlarged clitoris, but otherwise a fully functioning vagina. They might have what looks like a fully functioning vagina, but instead of ovaries, they have testes inside of them. They might actually have a scrotum, so they have testicles and a sac, but they don't have a penis. We've also seen cases of men that at puberty developed breasts, and we've had cases of women that thought that they were female, that they had all the characteristics, but they couldn't figure out, even though they were having a period, why they could not get pregnant. And the reason why was because they didn't have XX chromosomes. They had XY chromosomes, and they were supposed to be male, quote unquote, but that Y chromosome never activated during the embryonic stage, and so they stayed in the female template. So intersex individuals have been around since the dawn of time. It is just a natural part of our biology, but it shows that sex, your sexual characteristics, your chromosomes, and your gender are not necessarily intrinsically linked. And that brings us to the next section, transgender individuals. These are people that have a condition in which their psychological gender identity conflicts with their biological sex. So these are people that were born with one set of genitalias, and they were assigned at birth to be perhaps male, but by the age of 3, and we do see it as early as 3, these individuals now identify as, say, female, or if they were originally female, they now identify as male. There is a lot of controversy about this, especially in popular culture. The APA, however, does have the definitive stance that being transgender is a normal part of the human condition. It is simply a different way of being. And in many cultures, we find that people that are transgender are celebrated. We see in some Native American cultures that they're known as two spirits or even three spirits. We have seen people that are welcomed as a third gender, all sorts of things. So again, being transgender is something that has been around as long as people have been around. The other term here, transsexual, simply refers to a transgender person who undergoes surgery and hormone treatments to physically transform their body into the opposite sex. This is not something that is taken lightly, but really the only difference between someone that is transgender and someone that is transsexual is that a transsexual has gone through the process of transforming into their body into the gender that they align with. You do not have to, quote-unquote, have the surgery in order to be considered transgender. That is entirely up to the individual. And this is a really cool chart called the genderbread person. It's a great way to demonstrate that all the things we've been talking about happen parallel to one another. So, for example, your gender identity of where you find yourself, or how you identify yourself and your gender, is entirely separate from your gender expression. So, do you dress in more masculine clothes or more feminine clothes? And this is also entirely separate from your biological sex. And this is all also entirely separate from who you're sexually attracted to and who you're romantically attracted to. So all of these things run parallel to one another, and they're not actually something that happens at the same time. You know, we used to think that if you were a man, it meant that you liked women, that you had a penis, and that you wore pants. Well, now we know, just through research and through, evidence from talking to other people that are different from this, that is not always the case. Just look at gender expression, In American society, it is considered normal, to wear pants and things like that. But in Scotland, it is considered the most masculine and traditional thing to do to wear a kilt. But in the United States, we would call a kilt a skirt, and we would consider a very feminine thing to do. So that shows that gender expression really does vary depending on your culture. So that's just one way in which none of these things are as hard defined as we might like to believe. People are a lot more complicated than we've been taught throughout our entire lives. Moving on, we're going to start talking about paraphilias. Paraphilias are any of several forms of non-traditional sexual behavior where sexual gratification depends on an unusual experience, object, or fantasy. There are a ton of paraphilias out there, and I can't get to all of them, but we will talk about a few of them. Things like exhibitionism, or being aroused from exposing yourself to complete strangers. You are motivated to see that look of shock on that person's face when you expose yourself, often called flashers. Fetishism is arousal in response to inanimate objects like shoes or leather. We've seen latex fetishes, pillow fetishes, any number of things. If it exists, there's a fetish for it. And frauderism, arousal from touching or rubbing against a non-consenting person, such as in a bus or subway. So people are motivated sexually to do all sorts of things that might be considered outside the norm. And in some cases, they're illegal and are taking advantage of complete strangers or of others, such as in exhibitionism. But others are just different ways of having sex. Things like fetishism, these are just ways that people enjoy having sex, and they're different for each individual. And there are entire sub-communities devoted to leather, or devoted to role play, or any number of things. So paraphilias are an interesting look into sexual motivation itself. And that is it for this particular chapter. Please make sure that you're completing all of your assignments and submitting them by the due date. And I will see you next time for the next lecture.